Hello, everyone. Dr. Shabazz here, and today I'm going to present to you a review of chapters 1 through 3. I did post one on Canvas. It is an older one. It has much of the same content, but I thought I would make a brand new one to give a better context of what we have done this semester in some of the different cases that we have discussed. If you look on Canvas, and I will bring up the page here, as you can see, this is the announcement that I sent yesterday. I hope you all are getting these announcements via Canvas or set up some kind of alert so you don't miss these because they're very important. As you can see here in the exam review, I have talked about the form the exam will take, approximately 45 multiple choice questions and one short essay type question. And some of the additional materials that I'm requiring you to read are presented here. Theodore Levitt's Globalization of Markets, which is a very important article in international marketing. In fact, it was one of those articles that ignited a debate on globalization, this idea of global markets. Theodore Levitt was one that was credited with starting such a fierce debate. He had a lot of supporters and he had a lot of detractors who thought that his views were a bit extreme, naive, and a bit overreaching. And also the documentary, The Trade Trap. It's not really a documentary as it is a presentation of Ghana's trade sector and some of the issues that Ghanaian business people are having in dealing with the global markets. In that video, you will hear a lot of the buzzwords from Chapter 2 in terms of tariffs and subsidies and different requirements in terms of sanitation, inspections, and all of these things that serve as barriers for trade. And one of the things that we have to deal with when we're dealing in other markets is not only all of those exogenous factors, but we also have to deal with the political environment, economic, and the pestle C that I mentioned before: political, economic, social, technological, environmental, legal, cultural, pestle C. And then there are some others: competitive, human resource environment, financial, geographic. There are lots of different variables when you start talking about the trade issue. So that is a very interesting video to watch, and I think it's very informative. This is it here. That is Dr. Paul Krugman, who at this time, I believe he was at Yale University. And so they were interviewing him of what he thought about globalization. He had been a longtime advocate of globalization. Since this video, he has changed his views somewhat, still pro globalization, but in a bit more nuanced way. But this is a very interesting video to watch, and you will get a chance to see some of the challenges that not only countries like Ghana face, but other developing countries around the world. And this is the source of debate in terms of whether globalization provides equal opportunity for those nations that are seeking to rise and create a sustainable economic engine for their people. So the trade trap is a very good video. It's not that long. It is, if I look at this very quickly, it is 26 minutes. So it's roughly a half an hour long. And I think you'll get a lot out of the video. And not only that, you'll get a chance to see Ghana as it was then. This video has to be more than 15 years old. It's probably around 15 years old. And Ghana since then has gone through some changes in terms of their economy. And I understand that they have seen an uptick in their economic stability, and also with the addition in terms of their export sector, they have found reservoirs of oil, which complements their agricultural sector. They are the second leading producer of cocoa in the world behind Cote d'Ivoire. So I think you'll find it interesting. Some of the terminology in there you will come to understand, and that I will have questions on the exam about that segment, the trade trap. I also have some of the other comments about chapter 1. We talk about in international marketing, or in our class, multinational marketing, the idea of whether one should standardize, as Theodore Levitt states, or whether one should adapt to that market. Now, speaking of the argument, I want to just bring this article, Globalization of Markets, to the table because it's very important. This is a classic article which was written in 1983, the May-June issue of Harvard Business Review, and I read it during graduate school. And it was an interesting article, but it annoyed me a bit because of the language that he was using appeared to me to be a bit arrogant, and he was making a lot of comments about his views of how people in developing countries think and what they want. And so I'll just read the very first paragraph, and then we'll kind of unpack that, and then we will I'll move on to some other topics in the article, and then I will leave the rest for you to read and reflect on. So it starts out, a powerful force drives the world towards a converging commonality, and that force is technology. It has proletarianized communication, transport, and travel. It has made isolated places and impoverished peoples eager for modernity's allurements. Almost everyone everywhere wants all the things they have heard about, seen, or experienced via the new technologies. In that first paragraph, there is very little to debate because certainly there is technology has created this new platform where products and services are accessible the world over. And you don't necessarily have to have a situation where you even see the person that you're doing business with or that you even meet them. So technology has bridged that gap that was once there. The converging commonality, essentially, he's saying that these consumer behavioral trends have converged, and to a degree, he's right. There has been this idea of globalized consumer behavior. People have become more exposed not only to Western products and services, while that was the dominant flow from the West to the rest of the world, meaning fast food and all of the other consumer products that we know very well, there has also been a reverse globalization of products and services that we see coming into the industrial world. So I believe we're seeing a bit more of that, and that's outside the scope of this particular article because he doesn't talk about the reverse globalization. He only talks about, as you go further down on the next page, he gives some examples, and he talks about modernity. As you notice, I do a lot of highlighting here, and he's making a lot of relative statements. Modern is is relative to not modern, right? Darkness. He's talking about corrugated huts. And he is saying that essentially people in the developing world is seeking modernity and those or at least the trapments of modernity from the Western world. And he mentions a lot of products that are produced by the Western world. So it's a unilateral flow of this from the industrial world to the developing world. And of course, that has changed, as I had mentioned. But as you look at this, he's talking about certain products. He's talking about the Biafra's fratricidal war against the Igbos. That was the civil war of Nigeria in the late 60s, where there was the Igbos that tried to secede from Nigeria, tried to break away from Nigeria, and he's using that as a platform by saying the soldiers were listening to the radio while drinking Coca-Cola. As he mentions Volkswagen, he mentions French cut trousers here. All of these things are from the Western world. And then again, he mentions primitive here. He mentions advanced in contrast. So again, he's making a lot of statements about these states of being as far as consumer behavior is concerned. Now, one of the things he mentions was this idea of homogenization. Demand requires a search for sales opportunities in similar segments across the globe in order to achieve the economics of scale necessary to compete. So you're basically talking about an expansion of your production mechanism, your supply chain, and distributing that or decentralizing your production such that you increase your economies of scale. That can be said without much of an argument because that's exactly what has happened. But then he talks about standardization, which means that not only will the production be standardized, but also the markets will be standardized. And he says, going back, that national differences would no longer have the importance that it once had. And now some will take issue with that and saying that certainly national differences will still play an important role. And in that sense, he has perhaps overreached a bit because, of course, national differences are still very important. And I'm trying to find the statement where he makes reference to cultures being unimportant. Gone are accustomed differences in national or regional preference. Gone are the days when a company could sell last year's models or lesser versions of advanced products in the developed world. And gone are the days when prices, margins, and profits abroad are generally higher than at home. But it is the first statement, gone are custom differences in national or regional preference. That can be debated either way, but certainly national differences are still very important. So you want to take a look at that article, Theodore Levitt. It is extremely important in this body of literature. I also make mention of the globalization. Obviously there are arguments for and against. If you go to page 21, it begins talking about the driving forces of globalization. And they mention scale economies, just as you found in the Levitt article, and the reasons for globalization and the benefits. But there are also arguments against. I mentioned one in terms of the um, the lack of balance in some of the trade negotiations between developed nations and developing nations. So you'll find that in chapter 1. And so in chapter one, they basically give you an overview of marketing. They talk about the 4 Ps, which we learned in MAR 3023, the marketing mix, which is price, promotion, place, and product. And the difference is that when you go abroad, there's certainly the marketing mix in a foreign environment, but then you have additional exogenous factors that may affect your decisions of how you manage those 4 Ps. We talk about the PESTLE analysis, the political, economic, social, technological, etc., and the PESTLE C model, and then some of the others that I mentioned, such as the financial environment, geographic, competitive, the labor, human resource environment is also part of that equation. And then they give you the equation of value, what value is. And we know what a value proposition is. And it was offered that it is a promise. It is definitely a promise that if you, as a consumer, buy my product, this is what you will receive from it. And so, all the different things that you may want out of that product, we offer, whether it's convenience, whether it's better health, whether it's more confidence. This is the value proposition we offer. So that is value equal the benefits you get divided by the actual cost. And that cost can be, they have price in the book, but then in parentheses, they have money, time, and effort, which obviously those are costs overall. So this particular article here that we reviewed in class, it's actually this one. Make sure you go through this. If you didn't get a chance to read it, make sure you go through and get an idea of some of the things that Taco Bell is doing different in China. And not only that, the process in which the Yum brands had to go through in order to educate the Chinese on how to eat Mexican food. It's really American Mexican food because, of course, this is not the same as Mexican cuisine. It's been kind of Americanized, but all of these, the processes of not only eating, but the menu adaptation, including they include alcohol as part of their as part of their menu offerings. So lots of lessons to learn in that particular case. And I also have the slides. If you look, I have the slides here. So if you want to take a look at the slides, then they are there for your convenience. In this particular chapter, chapter 2, they talk about the political systems, or the economic systems rather, the global economic environment. But they're also talking about the way politics shapes the economics of a nation. And so they go and they give you several different types of economies: market capitalism, centrally planned capitalism, market socialism, and centrally planned socialism. So they give you those 4. There are plenty of different types of systems, but they give you those 4, and then underneath they put various countries. What else? Balance of payments, the inflows and outflows. Every country has a balance of payments. Most of the movement goes under current account, which is where the imports and exports are. The video trade trap. In this video, you'll see a lot of these terms used. This idea of subsidies, which can be in the form of a grant, low interest loan, technical assistance from the government to assist local producers, to give them kind of a even footing with foreign competition. And then finally, the chapter 3 deals with the idea of regional groupings. And there are a number of regional groupings. And not to mention, we're not talking about security groupings like NATO. We're talking about economic groupings like the USMCA, the CARICOM, which is the Caribbean Common Market, OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. There are many others. We know about the European Union, which was created as a, I would say, a counterweight to the United States. And that came into being in 1992. And then after that took place, the United States got together with Canada and Mexico to create NAFTA. And I believe that was around 95, 96 when that was created after the European Union. So you had competition. President Trump recently renegotiated NAFTA, which is now the United States, Mexico and Canada agreement, trade agreement. But European Union now has, I believe it has 27 members, minus the United Kingdom. We talked about Brexit with the journal article that was done during class. If you can look at the history of the EU, it is a very long history. There are the pioneers of the European Union, and the Treaty of Rome in 1957 was a key agreement involving the um, the founding nations. So there's NATO in 1949, and then you have the Treaty of Rome in 1957. 1992, and I think that's another page, but the 1992 was when the Maastricht Agreement, the Maastricht Treaty, was signed, which created the bloc that we now know as the European Union. And then in 2002, they the currency was in circulation. Now, in 1999, the euro was born. Um, it says here 11 countries adopted the euro, minus the United Kingdom. They decided to stay out for the time being. And as you all know, the United Kingdom pulled out of the European Union. They were never in the euro bloc, but they were part of the European Union. So that is we talk about regional groupings. The European Union is one that has been the most ambitious because they've included, as part of their arrangement, a common currency. There are a number of different levels of the regional integration, and they mention in the book uh, they give you 4 levels. They actually are missing one. They have uh, tariff-free zone. They have a common market. They have a customs union, which is generally going to be an arrangement that deals with external tariffs, ensuring that those who are not members don't play one nation against the other. So you have a uniform tariff for member nations. They have the economic union, and then what they don't have in the book is political union, which would include a centralized government for all the member nations. We have not seen that yet. The European Union is not a political union, it's only an economic union. So there's another level of integration that you'll find in some other books. So let me go through some of this material and kind of give you an idea of some of the things that will be covered. We're at about a half an hour in, just talking, giving an overview of certain concepts. But let me go through some slides and give some more details. World War II, of course, is a very important time, which after World War II, it spawned off a number of organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, the, I almost said WTO, but the GATT organization, which later became the WTO, and also the United Nations, which was a peacekeeping body, which was designed to prevent world wars from happening. And of course, for the most part, a world war has not occurred, but there have been many other wars since 1945. Here again, the 4 Ps, you have the definition of marketing, the AMA definition, and global marketing. But I also mentioned in the first week that you have domestic marketing, you have international between at least two nations, you have multinational, which should be two or more nations, multi meaning many. And then you have, of course, global marketing, which is spanning the entire globe. You also have different orientations here in terms of whether the markets exist or are they brand new markets. So some companies, when the domestic market is saturated, they'll seek other markets abroad to look for getting increasing their revenue and also increasing having a better economies of scale. And so you have existing markets, which is you're penetrating these markets with products that you have already had, or you have ideas of creating other products off that product line. Here you have brand new markets, developing new markets for your products, or developing markets for the products that you already have, or diversification strategy, which means you're introducing new products into new markets. Value chain is essentially the idea of supply chain management, but you have different values within the chain. Your procurement has a particular focus, R&D, manufacturing, transportation and logistics, such as or distribution, and then your marketing activities are also along the value chain. And it is that marketing organization that is responsible for helping to articulate the value proposition. That's a very important concept that you want to make sure that you understand. And then below they have the value equation, value equal benefits and price. Jagdish Begwadi, who talks about globalization, also in one of his books that I have here, In Defense of Globalization, he is obviously a firm believer with some caveats. And I think a lot of these pundits and scholars don't just take these concepts whole. They have a nuanced view of how globalization works. I have some other books on my shelf over here that have very different takes on globalization, and so, but it makes for a very good debate and very constructive debate. In class, I drew some diagrams of supply and demand, surplus, shortage, and these ideas are very important because you talk about the idea of supply and demand in domestic market, then the product life cycle, the introduction, growth, maturity, and decline, When that market declines, then you either have to improve your offerings, you have to get out of the domestic market altogether and just shut down, or you can get out of the domestic market and look for other markets overseas. And so those are all options when we talk about surplus, shortage in other markets, different product life cycles, controlling for all the barriers, exogenous factors, whether it be economic factors in your target nation, looking at inflation, looking at GDP per capita, looking at the income distribution, how big is the upper class, or looking at other demographics such as age, gender, and all of these things to target your market. Again, focus is extremely important. Pros and cons of globalization. It has been said many times, and even in your forum, your forum guests might talk about globalization and the benefits of globalization. And so I think we understand that concept. But you also have globalization in reverse. You have other countries now presenting to us products that have become a mainstay in American uh, consumer demand. And we're talking about Japanese products, we're talking about Korean products, we're talking about Chinese products that we know very well. Of course, the European products have been there for a very long time. But you had some trends under President Trump. He started to look more inward. And so there was this idea that America should walk back some of their globalization and look at bringing manufacturing back home, even though you have higher wages in the United States. So you have some very interesting trends here. And you still have the question as to whether nations are benefiting from globalization equally. There's the standardization versus adaptation model. That should you standardize, keep your product the same, or should you adapt it to suit those local markets? These are all questions. Single country marketing strategy versus global marketing strategy, of course, very, very different. You're still dealing with those exogenous factors that you find in either case. Are you going to go to just one country and focus on adapting to that one market, or are you going to try a standardization strategy, one size fits all to multiple countries? Then you have the assessment of many different blocks of countries or many different countries, the BRICS, the MENT, which is Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. You have other nations as well that kind of fit in that paradigm. The idea of localizing your markets. There are many different examples. We saw the Taco Bell example is one. There are many others. There's actually McDonald's is in the forefront of a lot of these strategies. Here they have McDonald's in France have muted colors, golden arches are more subtle. American franchisees saw success in France and implemented similar renovations. In Israel, it's very interesting because in Israel, they have kosher McDonald's. So the menu is suited towards the cultural needs of the Orthodox Jews. And not only that, the signage and the colors of McDonald's are different. They're blue and white. And so when you see a McDonald's that is blue and white, they still have the golden arches, but the facade is blue and white. And you know that is adapted to suit that particular market. So that was a very interesting change to the actual brand. And you wouldn't think a country would allow that, but in this case, in Israel, they have a different idea. I just want to show you the website of McDonald's, and the page that talks about where we operate. And this is very interesting because you go and you see all of these countries: North America, South America, European markets, African markets, Asian markets. You see all of these different McDonald's. And sometimes what I like to do is just merely start clicking on uh, different locations just to see what comes up, and if it is any different than what we know McDonald's to be here. Brazil has a lot of McDonald's. They have a lot of them. Almost, it seemed, every mile they have at McDonald's. And this is Brazil. They have a lot going on here. That is Brazil. All right, so let's see. Here's some of the adaptations for the Big Mac. As you look down, the McAloo Tikka potato burger and the chicken Maharaja in India, and you have some other adaptations. Then you have the orientation ethnocentric, which is more ethnocentric means that you have more of a narrow focus and you're going to have something that points to your own culture and your own ethnicity, and you extend that to the world, or you share that with the world. Then you have polycentric, which is poly is many, it's like multi, so you have more than one approach. It says here each country is unique, each subsidiary develops its own unique business and marketing strategies. So in the example I gave in class, I talked about this drink, the ABC health drink versus XYZ. You can establish production facilities, sales offices. You can have joint ventures. You can buy companies in other nations and establish subsidiaries. These are all very important concepts. Then you have regiocentric. You might have a regional strategy for a certain grouping of nations. And you have geocentric, which is the idea that your entire world is a market, and you may adopt a combination of strategies, whether it be an extension or extending this particular product to the entire world, or you want to adapt to certain markets and standardize in others. So you have a more broad, you have a broader focus. Different forces, multilateral agreements, and we spoke about some of the regional arrangements, but then you have other initiatives such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that the U.S. actually pulled out of under President Trump, and that was something that was supposed to galvanize Asian nations against the rising power of China. And so that was a very interesting arrangement. In fact, when I was in the Philippines and Vietnam, that is what they talked about. They talked about this idea of the TPP, and they were excited about it. But then when Trump came to power, he pulled out of it because he, I guess, didn't like the conditions of that agreement. Some of the restraining forces affecting global integration, management myopia, or just having this idea that your management style has to be the way it is. And so that's a problem when you're going into nations where certain traditions may be very different. In Japan, they tend to have a more egalitarian way of management, such that you don't have the corner office. And it's becoming more like that here, but everybody's in the same area in Japan. So you don't have these corner offices. The management is right there with everyone else. Everybody can see what everybody else is doing. In your meetings, if your manager has a meeting, he'll call you right in around his desk. You meet, and then you go and carry out those orders. Then you have certain controls in terms of perhaps it's labor agreements, perhaps it's other types of regulations that may affect globalization. And then you have those opposing to globalization. So lots of different concepts there in that chapter. I'm going to move to the second chapter or the second set of slides. So, chapter two here is a bit more technical in terms of the theoretical foundation, and these are points of history here. The idea of capitalism and socialism. 1917 is when the birth of communism in Russia was fought. The Russian Revolution under Vladimir Lenin, and then forward this idea of overthrowing the bourgeoisie and having a centralized government. And then, of course, e-commerce. We know the role that has played. We talked enough about globalization. These are some concepts that you should understand the differences and um, the idea of variations in these forms of economic systems. There are obviously different types of ways you can run a free market. No nation has a completely free market, and no nation has a completely centralized system. There are all these variations. Even though some of them might be slight, you have all these variations that handle various aspects of the economy. Then you have other categories. We saw the mint and we saw the BRICS earlier, and you have the BIMs here, the big emerging markets, economic freedoms we talked about, the difference between markets that have economic freedom versus those where the state controls the central market. You find the differences. And even in class, I gave an updated version of the economic freedom rankings, which is essentially the same. It hasn't been much change. I mentioned here in the current rankings, China ranks the 107th. And so those are some assessments that you can make before you go into countries. Here you have low income. They mention concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, but frankly, it's going to be in a lot of places and not just in sub-Saharan Africa. Although you have a lot of the low-income countries there, you have some that have risen. I mentioned Botswana, Rwanda are two countries, Ghana being another. So if you look, they have these Central Asian countries, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, maybe opportunities for economic growth. They have another Central Asian nation, Kazakhstan, which is undergoing turmoil as we speak. They are protesting over surging fuel prices. And here's an article in New York Times that talks about it. Revolt in Kazakhstan, what's happening and why it matters. And they say protests in the oil-rich Central Asian country gained momentum. The events threatened to reverberate across the region. This was earlier this month. You see the video footage there. So yes, these situations are very fluid because in one instance you see these middle income countries rising, but they may not have the political stability. So you have to have both of those in order to have a semblance of stability. You have all these different categories, and I won't go through all these. And the bottom of the pyramid, mistaken assumptions about the bottom of the pyramid. The poor have no money. Of course, we in America know that that is not necessarily the case. The poor are not too concerned with basic needs to waste money on non-essential goods. Well, again, we know that there are exceptions in that case. You see a lot of people who are struggling to make ends meet, but then they have the designer clothes, they have vehicles that are very expensive. And so obviously we understand that um, that point can't always be taken at face value. All these misconceptions about how you view people in other markets, particularly in poor countries. High income, 12,000 and above, industrialized, developed, post-industrial, all these different ideas and names for these group of nations. And then the G7, which you should make sure you know. And the G8 was Russia, but they were kicked out. And now we're at the G7. G20, I mentioned the G77, and many different other concepts, many concepts. But here, the balance of payment, the inflows and outflows of countries, you should be familiar with. And then there was the idea of devaluation that was mentioned, currency fluctuations. I gave an example of a transaction between the US and I believe it was, I just gave a general example of a European buyer and the difference that it makes when you look at not only exchange rate, but what the contract is denominated in. What is the currency that the contract is denominated in? It makes a difference. If it's denominated in dollars, then the European bears risk exposure. If it's denominated in euros, then the American bears risk exposure. And you see the numbers play out here. And these are both contracts that are, in this case, 1 million US dollars, and then this is 1.1 million euros that um, will be exchanged as a result of the transaction. Hedging involves the balancing of risk. One of the things is I mentioned in that example I gave that you can hedge your um, your risk by ordering your money in advance at a forward market rate. That locks in the rate of exchange such that if the currency value should plummet, which if it happened would result in you having to get more money to pay the same amount, you lock in the rate of exchange and you know exactly how much it is that you're going to need in order to fulfill that contract. But in some of those transactions, the exchange rate and the amount owed is laid out in the contract, so that there are no there's less speculation as far as that's concerned. And then lastly, as I close here, we're at about the hour mark. I want to lastly, you have global trade environment. And this is more dealing with regional groupings. And I mentioned earlier the EU and the USMCA. They still have NAFTA here, but it's the USMCA. And of course, we talked about the GATT, which was founded in 1947 and became the WTO in 1995. And it is a referee or arbiter of trade disputes. So if a nation feels that they're being mistreated, they can go to the WTO and complain. There was a case in my global business class. I show a movie called Life and Debt. And in this case, it involved the banana industry, and it was called Banana Gate at the time. The US, very powerful banana lobby there, because you have Chiquita, Doe, and Del Monte, who control together control 95% of the world's banana market. But they complained to the WTO, or they through Bill Clinton, they complained to the WTO that they were being treated unfairly in Europe. Now, bear in mind, they control 95% of the banana market. Europe, on the other hand, had as part of its colonial legacy tariff-free access for Caribbean, African, and Pacific countries, or African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, ACP countries as they are called. But the big three banana companies wanted to also compete in that market, and they felt that these countries had an unfair advantage. Now, bear in mind, this is these powerful multinational corporations. And essentially, what would happen is if the American companies competed in that market, there's no way that those other countries would be able to compete. But saying that, the US won the arbitration case, and Europe had to make some changes in their tariff policy, and which is essentially going to kill a lot of those, or maybe not kill completely, but certainly endanger their market. So here you have the World Trade Organization in 1995, PTAs, which are what you have in USMCA, where you have tariff-free access between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. There are a number of PTAs that have been reported to the WTO, and of course, you still have to operate in the within the WTO rules of the treaty, such that you're not creating friction amongst the nations who are not members of the PTA. So here you have the hierarchy of, it says PFTs, but I think that should be PTAs and not PFTs. So here you have an increasing interdependence. At the bottom, you just have the free trade arrangement. Then you have a customs union where you have a uniform uh, external tariff policy. Here you have not only a common external tariff policy, but you also have freedom of movement of factor endowments like labor. For example, you might have a visa, which if you want to travel to another member nation, you don't need a visa. You only need some kind of a pass or a particular stamp on your passport. Then you have the economic union, which abolishes tariffs, have a common external tariff policy, factor endowments, and in some cases, economic harmonization. In EU's case, that would be a common currency. Then in some textbooks, they give you a fifth level, which is political harmonization. We have not seen a regional grouping come up with a political central government. And here in this textbook, they put political harmonization with the top level. Moving on, they give you some more details, the FTA, and then the external uniform tariff policy here includes elimination of internal barriers and establish common external barriers. Some examples of that: common market, which includes freedom of movement of factor endowments, labor, capital, and information. European Union, of course, we know about the euro. And here you have the partners. As you can see, this is good to know. Canada and Mexico are the top. When you talk about trading partners, import and exports, Canada is number one. Mexico is number two. And then you look at China. Now, here in terms of imports, China is number one, followed by Mexico and Canada. You have a number of regional groupings here. They mention CARICOM, the Caribbean Common Market, and you have many others that are listed here. Mercosur is commonly mentioned, Andean Community, and many of them overlap, by the way. And here's the USMCA income and population. As you can see here, it represents a very large block. And you have some of the others. Again, some of them overlap. There's CARICOM, Caribbean Common Market, Asean, Singapore, second largest container port. I actually was in Singapore some time ago. Very impressed with the country. It's essentially a city. It's a country, but it's a city. It's a giant city. And I saw when I was at Gardens by the Bay, which is a tourist spot, you can see the ports in a distance. You can see the cranes that carry the containers from one part of the port to the other, so that they can be carried and moved to perhaps a hitch. A trailer would take them away and move them to their destination. It is a very interesting place. That's all I can say, but it is, along with other countries, like, for example, Dubai, has become transshipment ports for goods moving through. Here they mention the Treaty of Rome. That was actually 1957. And here they mention the Lithuania joining the Eurozone, the Maastricht Treaty, which was 1992. It may have been signed I wonder if it was signed in 91, but mostly the Maastricht Treaty, and we saw another slide, mentions 1992. And that's, I believe it's 1992. The EU will become 27 after Brexit, represent a large bloc, Middle East, which includes OPEC is primarily Middle Eastern nations in terms of the oil production, but you also have others such as Nigeria, which is a part of OPEC, Venezuela is a part of OPEC. I think at one time Indonesia was, but they pulled out. And even these groups overlap. Then you have the Africa, 54 countries. There are a number of different blocks within Africa. The ECOWAS here, the Economic Community of West African States, is called ECOWAS. I actually did my dissertation on that region, dealing with e-business and using ECOWAS nations using e-business as a platform for trade, for increasing trade, which at the time I did the research was only 6%. The member nations of ECOWAS only traded with each other 6%, which is a very low amount. The rest of the trade primarily went to Europe. East African Community, they had a regional grouping from 67 to 77 when it collapsed, and then I think they relaunched it. Then you have what's called SADC, the South African Development Community. So that's going to do it for today. It was longer than I wanted it to be. We're roughly at about an hour. So hopefully you're able to get through this. And I will probably have basic questions on the chapter 3. I don't expect you to memorize all the countries, but I'll ask basic questions about the levels of integration and maybe some details about the groupings. But I'm not going to give an extensive test on just naming countries in the groupings. But you should know the EU, you should know the USMCA at a minimum. And then there are other arrangements such as Asean and OPEC. OPEC is not mentioned, but that is a grouping more of like a cartel Not in the sense that it's illegal, but a cartel is just a grouping of nations that is centered around a particular resource. There are cocoa cartels, there are coffee cartels, and of course there are drug cartels as well. But that's all I'm going to say today. Hopefully, I'll have this up by Saturday night or Sunday morning, and you'll be able to view it at your leisure or not view it in its entirety. But hopefully, it's of some help. These are some of the topics that will be covered. Be on the lookout for more information. Make sure you watch the Trade Trap and also go over the Globalization of Markets by Theodore Levitt. And if you have not read the Taco Bell in Mexico, you want to make sure that you look at that. Chapter 2, of course, is some parts in there about economic systems, which is impacted by the political environment, and all the other factors that we mentioned. And then at the end, it talks about balance of payments and some of the currency dynamics that you may have gotten in other classes. So make sure you're knowledgeable of those. I think this exam is well within your ability. So make sure you go through the material. I put slides up. So if you want to look at those as a complement to your study, by all means do so. I would not just focus on the slides because, as you can see, they're very schematic. They don't give you the greatest of detail. Okay? Study hard and rest well Sunday night so you're ready to take the exam on Monday afternoon. All right? Have a good weekend. I'll see you Monday. Take care.